everybody, it's Brian Mahoney, the president and CEO of Trender Research and president of OTT Executive Community. We're continuing in our podcast series, bringing in and talking to and learning from leaders of the industry. Today, we're joined by Mike Bloxham from MAGID. Welcome, Mike.
Morning, Brian. How are you doing?
Thank you for joining us. What part of the world are you zooming in from today?
I'm currently at home up in the Hudson Valley, about 100 miles north of Red Hook. If I look out of my window over there, through the leafless trees, I can just about see the Catskills.
Very nice. Okay, that's great. That's a great spot. You probably got some of the snow that we got here in the Boston area in the last couple of days.
Yeah, pretty much gone, but apparently we've got a storm coming in tonight, which isn't much fun.
Great. Well, welcome. So for folks that don't know you, and that's few in this industry, just a little bit about yourself and what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, as you can tell by the speech impediment, I'm an exiled Brit living over here. I've been over here for about the last, actually, almost 20 years. And I've worked in the media research space for about 30 years now, which is a slightly frightening thought. Always focused really on what drives or inhibits engagement on the part of consumers with different media propositions, looking across the board in media and various other things as well. I mean, we're doing work with Formula One teams and so forth. But yeah, started out in the UK and Europe, came over to the States about 20 years ago, working for Ball State University and a big initiative there, and then moved back into my natural environment, the commercial world.
That's great. Awesome. Well, welcome. We've collaborated over the years through our community, through our magazine. MAGID have been great supporters over the years. So grateful to you for that, but also a great source of insight for the industry. So we're going to kind of focus on that and talk a little bit about the trends and things you see happening right now. Any new research or insights coming out of MAGID these days?
Yeah, well, I mean, MAGID's one of those companies. It's there's always something going on. We can have our fingers into as many pies as possible. I mean, the company's been around over 65 years now, which is kind of crazy. But we've been doing a lot of work, as has others, in the world of streaming and so forth. And one of the big things I've been involved in with colleagues for the last several months now is a body of work around the subject of churn in subscription-based streaming. And this is something which kind of has grown out of work that we've done over the years. Many people know that we run an annual, well, actually a biannual survey now, called the Video Entertainment Study. And within that, for a number of years, we'd asked this question among the kind of battery of questions that relate to churn and retention. And it was, when you join a service, how long do you intend to subscribe to the service when you're joining it new? Is it, is it a month? Is it 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12, more than a year, 2 years, whatever? And it was always very interesting to us that sort of on average, the answer comes out that there's about 40, 41, 42% of people who don't intend to be there longer than 6 months. Some of them markedly less, but is that 6 month period? And you think that's a big number when you're looking at a service which relies on keeping people around for 12 months and longer. And there was always this question, okay, so who are these people? Because not everybody is equally inclined to churn. So we went out and we've done a segmentation of the population at large in order to get a better understanding of who's more or less likely to churn, why, what are the predictors of churn, and so on. And it's turned into a really interesting body of work. In fact, MAGID's launched a subscriber science practice off the back of this work. And we started to get really good engagement with streaming clients. Wall Street's shown interest, which is very gratifying. And we're just now starting to socialize it. I've done a couple of presentations, one for the ARF online and one at the Media Insights and Engagement Conference at the end of January. So we're just now starting to come out. And this is actually the first time I think I've been on having a conversation with somebody like yourself about it in a forum like this.
Oh, wow, that's great. I feel very honored.
Not at all. I'd love to chat about it. It's because it's really interesting. There's some stuff there that defies the conventional wisdom a little bit when you dig into the data. And churn is, it's one of the folks on Wall Street was saying, it's a seriously under-researched subject. It's a massively important input to the analyst models, and it's a massively important issue, obviously, to every single streamer. It's not just about acquiring subscribers. You've actually got to retain them and get them engaged and fully monetize them. But it's something that we've looked at, I think, in a slightly simplistic way as an industry for some time. The streaming business has been rushing for growth, and it's really been based on tonnage. If you get enough new subscribers in a quarter, Wall Street is satisfied, and that is deemed to be the measure of success. And it's cost a lot of money to do that, but companies have been going for growth. But the reality is not every subscriber is equally valuable. Not every subscriber is equally likely to stick around for 12 months of the year, year in, year out. So if you add 1 million subscribers in a quarter, say, if all of those subscribers are those people that just aren't going to churn, they're going to be happy, they're going to stick around, that's great. You can project what you're going to get out of that. But that's never the case. You need to understand what proportion of those subscribers are not going to be around for 6 months. They have a high proclivity to churn, and therefore they're making your subscriber base, they're making your business more volatile because they are going to come and go.
It's really interesting to me because what you're catching is the sort of the intentionality of churn, where I think most people, or I sort of coming into this conversation, just assume that it's kind of something you do off the cuff. You're like, I'm not going to pay this bill anymore. Or we already binged the show we want from the service. We're just going to cancel it now. But what you're saying is people are going in ahead of time saying, yeah, I'm good for 3 months or 6 months. I don't plan to have this forever. I mean, I don't represent that demographic. We sign up for like everything in our house. My kids sign up for new things all the time, and we never churn. We probably need to take an inventory and just be like, all right, who's actually watching these shows? So how do you kind of get inside their head about what their motivations are when they're actually telling you in advance they're not going to stick around?
Right. Well, that's actually one of the central and most important factors of the whole body of work and the whole issue, frankly. We have this view, this default view, that churn is about some inadequacy in the service, some perceived weakness in the service. It's everything from like, well, I just can't find stuff I want to watch anymore. I've watched loads of this stuff that comes up on the recommendations, and I find stuff elsewhere that I want to watch, so maybe there's nothing there. Or the user experience is perceived to be in some way poor, or just not enough content. Sometimes it's a price value thing. And yeah, fine. Those are things which are innately about the service, but not all churn is actually driven by the service, interestingly. And you touched on it in what you were saying there. Some people, they bring an attitudinal profile that means they are much more likely to churn. It's how they engage with media. I mean, I'll talk about it in terms of 2 of the segments we found. I mean, basically, we identified 6 segments across the population, one of which is that segment which is barely engaged. About 74% of that segment has no streaming service at all, but it's important to include them in a segmentation like this so you have a full understanding of the landscape. So you've got 5 segments that are actively streaming and that you would spend marketing dollars against. 2 of them, for example, there's one that we call hypers, and these are voracious consumers of all media. They're very engaged with everything. They're casting around it. TV is not the most important things in their life. They don't think about it in terms of platforms. These people are very content driven, and they got a lot of FOMO. These are the people, they don't want to not see the stuff that everybody's talking about. And interestingly, they're the people who are actually your hit makers. They talk about content and their favorite shows more than any other group. They post about it online. They follow it online. And they're actively promoting your content. You need these people in your subscriber base. And they spend more money on content than anybody else. They watch a load of content, lots of different types of content. They're interestingly also the people that share passwords more than anybody else. But the downside is these are the people who churn more than anybody else. So they're very desirable customers. You want them in your mix, and they're great from an ad sales point of view if you're ad supported as well, because they're upscale. They're a very desirable advertising target. But they churn more than anybody else because that's how they engage with all media. They don't just do this with streaming. They're in and out of different services. They're kind of curating their portfolio of entertainment experiences. So that's one group.
So hold on. So let me dig down there a little bit. So they're actively managing. They're not passive sitting by. They're fully engaged, which is great. Everybody loves engagement, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're committed to stay forever.
Right. They're committed to their content experience, the content that they want at that time. And it's actually a part of a very engaged audience. They're proactively engaged. So I use the word curating. And it's not about money. They don't churn out because they can't afford it. They kind of churn out and say, well, look, I've got this service. I don't think I'm going to be watching anything over here. There's nothing that really interests me. I'm going to put that money somewhere else. So they go. And because they're very media savvy, because they're very comfortable across media platforms, they're very comfortable churning. It's easy for them. It's not a big deal. Now, there's another segment called the loyalists, which are also real TV lovers. They're very engaged with content, but they're of a mindset that says, well, okay, if I'm not going to watch that for a while, I can't be bothered to churn. They're not going to churn out as much. So it's not that they'll never churn, but they churn for different reasons. If a loyalist churns, it's more likely because they perceive there is a problem with the service. The hypers, if they churn, it's because, okay, I'm going to come back.
That's just what they do.
I haven't fallen out of love. I'm just going out for a while and then I'll come back later. So that's very interesting to me, because it also comes back to the other point of this. You can't really understand churn unless you understand how resubscription falls in. Not net new, but when are those people going to come back? So there's just a layer of nuance there that we've not really been considering.
So how would you determine that? I mean, so you're doing the survey kind of advanced, exit surveys, how do you find out like what was their real motivation there? Because you're right, the more sophisticated group, you call them the hypers, is that right?
Yeah.
That's just who they are. They're going to be in and out. They're just managed. They're curating, the self-curating. And then the loyalists, they're bummed out about something, right? That something is missing from the service. You want to know what that is so you can fix it if you can, right?
That's it. So there's all churn, materially speaking, is bad, right? Somebody decides they're going to stop paying for something. That's not a good thing from a business point of view. But some churn, that kind of churn I was talking about with regard to the hypers, is actually strongly correlated with growth. So in a way, we're having this internal argument. Do we call it good churn, bad churn? Because good churn is kind of a contradiction in terms intuitively. Or is it subscriber-based churn and service-based churn, where one is much more about who the subscriber is rather than what the service is? It's both of those things. In a funny kind of way, we've started talking about churn is the cholesterol of streaming.
I was going to say that. Good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. I still haven't figured that out.
Well, so yeah, right. Who has? But you know that there's this thing called good cholesterol and there's this thing called bad cholesterol.
Right.
And the bad cholesterol is like the donuts. And you don't want to be eating too many donuts, but you can eat more avocado because that's good cholesterol, right? Yeah. And it's the same kind of thing. You shouldn't be trying to eliminate churn. I don't think anybody seriously is. You're on a hiding to nothing. It's not going to happen. But the reality is, if you have a percentage of your user base which falls into that hyper category, there's another group called digitarians as well, but where churn is not about you failing, it's about them being super engaged, then you want to manage that kind of churn differently from the churn that is about some perceived inadequacy in the service, lack of content, price too high, whatever the heck it is. Because if you're a hyper and I'm a streaming service, my goal with you, Brian, should be to get you to stay for an extra month and maybe 2 months out of 12. Get you to come back sooner or stick around a little bit longer, because incrementally that throws an awful lot of money off to the bottom line. I mean, it's not unusual for services to have 35, 40, 45% of their subscriber base in these high churn categories, these people who are going to come and go. If you can get 2 more months out of just like 25% of that group, for some services, that's about $100 million a year.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, because I think what you're presenting, Mike, is this dynamic where you have to take sort of a portfolio management approach to these different segments, right? When we think of subscribers, as digital marketers, we're thinking opens, clicks, abandon rates, churn, all this other fun stuff collectively. But if you can understand that psychographic of what's causing them to come in and out, you can be a better marketer, right?
That is exactly right. And I love the fact that you reference portfolio management, because it's what we talk about. It is just like an investment strategy. You got high risk and you got low risk and you got stuff in the middle. And this is exactly the same. We kind of got an index within this work of, we call it the volatility index. And it's an indication of how exposed individual services are to these people who have a high proclivity to churn, because that's volatility in the business. And it doesn't mean they're all going to churn, because not all services are equally churnable. If Netflix is not as churnable, and Amazon is not as churnable as some of those other services that, they're not so fundamental to me necessarily, but that's different for everybody.
Right.
So the portfolio management thing is really important, because you are going to, you should manage them differently. For people like the loyalists or mainstreamers, another low churn group, you want to focus on engaging them as much as possible, so that you're as central in all the services they have as that you can be. But with the hypers, again, for most services, the job is probably going to be getting incrementally more months out of those people, rather than just uniformly trying to get them to be year-round subscribers. They will be for some services, but you need to understand whether that's you or not. And for most services, it's not.
Right.
There's a high probability they're going to go. So get those incremental months, and then you should have a completely different line of communication to those people.
Right.
You should be talking to them when you've still got their details, but they're not actively subscribing. What are you going to send to them? How are you going to engage them to get them back a month earlier than they're going to come back anyway?
So interesting, because, I think in that first group, the hypers, you could get your feelings hurt, like, oh, you're leaving us. What did we do wrong? Like you're a friend, someone lost a friend, but what you're saying is don't, just say, hey, see ya. I'm glad you had a good experience while you were here. Come back soon. But because they're sophisticated in managing, curating their portfolio of services, because they're also doing their own portfolio management, there might be a lower bar to get them back at some point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the hypers, and I'm talking about hypers and loyalists because they're kind of.
I know we got 3 more to cover, but this is so exciting so far. So sorry.
Yeah, we probably won't get into all of them, but I mean, they're good examples because they're both highly engaged, but one's highly engaged, low churn, the other's highly engaged, high churn. So you need to have a different dialogue there. And yeah, you do need to treat them differently if you're going to get the most out of them. If you just keep communicating with people who are going to churn but are going to come back, and you just keep talking to them in the way that you talk to everybody, well, you're inevitably going to get less value back out of them. And hypers they sign up for services at a very slightly higher rate than they churn out.
Okay.
And it's fascinating. I mean, I mentioned that question earlier on. By the way, all of this is highly predictive. We developed a really strong predictive model. It's got
interesting.
R squared of over 0.9. It's crazy.
I'm going to ask you that's I want to understand how you do that, what your model looks like, that you can actually predict that. Like, what are the markers, for those different segments?
Well, we got a great data science team led by Tony Cardinale, who used to be at NBC. You probably know him, and they've done some great work on this. And one of the most predictive things is this question that we ask about intent to remain with a service for a period of time. And again, good example, that first 6 months is critical. It's kind of like a battleground. If people get beyond the 6 months, most people are going to stay for more than a year. But when you break it out, or you look at it, and I said earlier that there was that kind of 41% number of the population at large are thinking they're not going to be there in more than 6 months, sometimes often less. You break that out by segment and you really start to see very starkly just how different people are attitudinally. So you got like 72% of hypers plan to be gone within 6 months. Whereas the loyalists, again, highly engaged, love TV, it's 22% of them.
So it's the inverse. Wow.
Yeah. So it's a really stark differential. And, others are Digitarians, like 58% of them are going to expect to be gone within 6 months. They're not all going to be gone. And it doesn't apply equally to all services. That's really, really important. You've got to know how churnable you are for each of the segments that make up your subscriber base. The fun thing about this is, of course, we've looked across the marketplace, and most services have a very detailed segmentation, and they're really, understanding what's driving churn within their service. We're able to look across all services, so you can actually provide a relative perspective of how a service is doing against a whole range of different metrics. And you asked about what are the drivers, of the predictive model. The other things that have a strong relationship to whether or not people are going to churn are things like what we call primacy. Is this a service you go to first? That is a key thing. Another one is we have this thing called power scores, where you basically ask the question, which service would you most be prepared to give up, and which service would you least be prepared to give up? And then you look at the vector of the two. And those power scores are also good indicators. So there's a whole array of different things. But it's fascinating to start working with this, because you can look segment by segment at the decay curve over a period of time. How many are going to be gone within 3 months, 6 months? And then where does it flatten off?
And it just helps you understand, when you're reporting to the board or to the street, if you had these sort of these segments and you were tracking them separately, it would give you a much better sense of the health of the business. It's just like relationships. You've got those friends that you don't hear from for months, if not years. They drop in and there's intense, like you're doing everything together. You're picking up from, an old college roommate or something. And then you got those loyal friends that are there with you every day. If you do or say something that offends them, that's when they go away, as you mentioned, the loyalist, it's more with hurt feelings. So before we get too much further, we do have those 3 other segments. Maybe we can just quickly give an overview of what they're about.
Sure. Well, the other group that's very low churn is called mainstreamers,
Okay.
and these aren't nearly as adventurous as a lot of other people. They're not going to go off and explore the newer things, the nether reaches of the media verses, if you like, quite as willingly. They tend to have fewer services. They're quite hard to get, actually. Hypers are really easy to acquire because they're out looking for everything. If you can convince them there's something worth looking at or people are talking about it, you'll get hypers. Low cost of acquisition. Mainstreamers, higher cost. They don't tend to churn though, but they subscribe to fewer things. And I think of them as they subscribe to the obvious stuff. So you're going to find them at Netflix. You're going to find them at Amazon. Hulu does well. Disney does pretty well with them because it's a big familiar brand. You know Disney and you know there's going to be good content there. So some of them have gone to Disney. Apple, interestingly, has a pretty good representation because, again, it's the Apple brand. A load of those people will have Apple product. So that, but they don't tend to go very far down the list.
And how are they different from the loyalists, the mainstreamers?
They're not as engaged with TV. TV is not as important to them, and they don't have as many services. The loyalists will have more services. They have TV lovers, basically. But their real difference from is that they don't tend to churn. So they have some similarities to the hypers, but the big vector is the propensity to churn.
So I'm trying to figure out what my family is, because we seem to sign up for every service, even though I asked my wife, my kids, and we don't watch as much. We don't watch that much TV. It seems like, maybe specific shows. So maybe you have a category for me, or maybe we're in between two segments.
Well, I mean, you might be like me. I fall squarely into the loyalists. I watch too much TV. Yes, we've signed up for loads of services. We never churn because, I mean, I don't have to worry.
We're also in the business, right? So we got that.
Yeah. But, my wife is the same and she's not in the business, but we're fortunate we don't have to worry about the money. Actually, the cost thing is really interesting. Conventional wisdom would say, well, obviously household income, disposable household income is going to be predictive of churn. It's not very predictive at all.
Wow. That's interesting.
It is predictive of how many services a household is likely to have, which makes perfect sense.
Right.
So yeah, there's very little relationship between household income and churn. It's much
so you
more
could sign up for a service. You may not sign up for as many because that's tied to your income, but that doesn't necessarily predict whether you're going to leave a service or not in the future.
Correct. Yeah, it's not a good predictor. It really isn't. There are many better predictors of that.
Wow. I mean, that's counterintuitive. I think a lot of the marketers out there are scratching their head like, oh, wow, I've been spending the big bucks on sponsoring the high end thing because I think that I'm going to get a longer, lifetime value out of that viewer. Okay. So we got one more segment to cover or two?
Yeah, there's the inerts I mentioned earlier. They're largely not engaged. They're there for completeness. You wouldn't necessarily spend marketing dollars. Although, if you're like somebody like Netflix, Amazon, they could probably get more people out of the inerts because there are some there that are on the cusp. They've got a service. They might be add some more, but there's not. For the other services, there's not a lot of potential there. You should be focusing on the others. One of the others is what we call digitarians. These are also a higher than average churn segment in terms of their proclivity to churn. But this is an interesting group because TV is really not that central for them. Yes, they'll watch some TV, they'll engage with streaming, but these people are into YouTube, they're into Instagram, they're into social media and so forth. They're more adventurous. They skew younger, unsurprisingly.
Yes.
And they're a little more promiscuous, if you like, than the average in terms of moving between services, but they're not super engaged. And then the last one is what we call the pragmatics, which I always think sounds a little bit like a great name for a punk band or something. And they tend to move with the market. They're quite small. There's only about 10% of the population that fit with this group. They have an average proclivity to churn, and they'll go with where the market generally goes. So they'll pop up across most of the services to some extent. But I think coming back to your point, you've got to take a portfolio approach to this. If you understand the distribution of the segments within the subscriber base, then you can predict churn very closely. But you also then, I think it's the only way you're going to be able to maximize the value out of what are different attitudinal groups. And we haven't done that typically within the streaming business, other than strictly within services where people are looking at their own subscribers, basing a lot on behavioral data on the platform, which shows they watch. But that often leaves out a deeper understanding of the attitudinal drivers, because a hyper and a loyalist might watch a bunch of the same shows, but one of those people is a much greater flight risk than the other.
Right.
And so you really got to have differentiated messaging if you're actually going to get fullest value out of them.
Yeah. And I think, Mike, this research is coming at the perfect time, right? Because as I've said in previous podcasts, the adults are in charge now. You know, these vanity metrics of just signing up as many subscribers and viewers as you can to the service, kind of mindlessly, you know, and that's what you promote to Wall Street. It doesn't work anymore, right? Because not only do we have to profitably acquire content and make sure that it's, you know, matching to the right viewers that are willing to pay for it, we got to think about this life cycle of a viewer and the long-term value and the short-term value, it sounds like. So how do you, if you put your, I don't know, CMO hat on or your CFO hat on, how do you make use of this model or these numbers to better manage how you attract and retain your viewers and subscribers?
Well, you have to understand, obviously, where you are now in terms of what's your mix of segments, and how does that relate to where you are in your business cycle right now? Are you all about driving growth because you're relatively new and you've still got some of that runway to go before you're going to plateau? Are you already on the plateau, and are you not looking at such rapid growth? You're still pursuing it, but you're not expecting such high growth, and it's more about engagement and better value out of your subscribers. Every service is different, so there's no one size fits all solution. It's not that you've got to have an equal percentage of each of these segments or whatever. There are times when you want to drive more growth, and there are some services that actually are in that situation and they don't have enough churn because they're not attracting enough of those hypers who are actually your hit makers and who do basically give you cultural relevance. And sometimes you can look at the stats and you realize that, okay, that service has got pretty low churn relative to its peers in the rankings. But then you look deeper and you realize, oh, that's because the churn they have got is the wrong kind of churn. They need some of that churn that comes with the excitement of having great content that people are talking about and you want to watch. So you got to say at a different stage of growth, you probably want a different reliance on those high churn hit making segments, the hypers and the vegetarians, versus loyalists and mainstreamers. You want enough of those at any one time, but if you're trying to drive growth, you need to accept that there's a certain type of churn that's going to be a part of what you do. Right. So, and then with the predictive element, you can actually start to do scenario planning, and you say, okay, well, what if we bumped up the presence of one particular segment by 10%, another one by 5%? What would that do to our churn rates? And from there, you can start to project revenues. Right. I mean, I think in relation to this, we're actually using the wrong metric. Simply saying, how many subscribers have you got? And say, okay, well, they've got 100 million subscribers, 120 million subscribers, whatever it is. Like we were talking about before, that's not a very clear understanding of just how many subscribed months you're going to have in a given year. And I think that's the metric. We need to start talking about total number of subscribers, total number of subscribed months, and you can project that. And we're actually tracking all of this now. We have an ongoing tracker out in the field, started in January. It's going to be going out every month. Awesome. And very soon we're going to be able to project resubscribe rates by segment, by service, which starts to complete that picture. Oh, and the other thing we're doing, I think you're familiar with our emotional DNA product, which is a huge data set in field all the time, looking at how people perceive and relate to and consume thousands of shows across the network. We're actually doing the work right now to be able to integrate the streamer segmentation into eDNA, so you can then start to get title level insights about which shows are more likely to acquire people for a streaming service, which shows are going to be your retention drivers by segment. And that's going to be
now you just blew my mind. Now, right, you know, you're taking these two data sets, these two concepts, and putting them together. I mean, brilliant people there at MAGID. It's quite incredible. Yeah, so let's explore this a little bit. So it's not total number of subscribers. It's or maybe it's both, right? You know, so you said months subscribed. Is that the metric?
I think it should be. We got to move in that direction, yeah, because 100 million subscribers isn't 100 million months in any given year or in any 3-year period. You're going to be looking at it simply isn't, because people aren't going to stick around, and some of those are going to come back. When are they going to come back is my question. Are they how many are away for 3 months? How many are away for 4 months? 1 month? I don't know. That's what we can get at. So you can then start to say, all right, subscribe months in the last 12 average is this, and the average by segment if you want to do that. And then you can project out going forward once you're able to project resubscribes, which, as I say, we'll be able to do in a couple of months.
And you said you're
think
going to be able to tie this in the future to titles, because I think that's one
Yeah.
of the key issues too, is how do you acquire, like, what is the cost and what is the right path to acquire subscribers based on, let's say, these 6 segments, and how do you tie that back to your inventory, right? Because right now, I mean, if you look at the big services, there's so much churn, there's mergers and acquisitions, and they're spinning off new services, and some they're taking back in and folding it back in. So somebody internally has a huge content management, inventory management headache they're trying to figure out right now.
Exactly. One of the things that we have within the emotional DNA product is this question about whether or not you would sign up for a service to get access to a show, or if a show left a service, would you leave that service? Would you follow it? Or would you keep the service? And that enables us to get to that point about title level strength or power, if you like, to drive acquisition, to drive retention by segment. And that way you can look, and your point about cost is really important, because you don't want to have to produce a Game of Thrones or a Stranger Things every time to try and attract people. There are some shows out there which are smaller shows and they're cheaper shows to produce, which appeal to some of these people. But if you know the mix of programming that appeals to different segments and their proclivity to churn, then you don't have to always fall back on those big tentpole releases. You might want to market the heck out of something that's much smaller, but it really does appeal to what is a key segment for you and where you need greater strength with that segment. So start to have a differentiated marketing platform at that point that relates not only to the type of messaging that you put out there and how you might try to get somebody back rather than keep them with it and be more engaged. You can actually leverage different content to do that once you understand how that content resonates with people. And part of the emotional DNA thing, as the name implies, is we have chapter and verse on how people perceive the emotional tonality of programming that they watch and how it resonates with them. And that can inform the kind of messaging that you put out there, or the clips that you use in your marketing, because you know that, okay, they love this show, it's a high adrenaline show, it's fast paced, it's exciting, as opposed to a show that's perceived to be moving and uplifting. You're going to use those differently for different people.
Yeah, I mean, now we're playing 3-dimensional chess, right? Because now you're looking at portfolio management from an inventory perspective. Again, mind blown. There's got to be some crazy algorithm, and I wasn't very good at calculus, but I imagine there's a fair bit of it in your algorithm there, to your predictive model. We don't have a huge amount of time left here. One big question I do have for you, Mike, does this model work for subscriber services, SVOD as well as AVOD and FAST? Is it the same kind of concepts, or do you have to kind of tweak it a little bit?
Yeah, it's principally directed towards subscription-based, whether advertising supported or not. But we do have a bunch of data in there about FAST services, so we need to understand their complete portfolio.
Right.
We know that hypers are very much into subscription video, but they also use ad-supported services that are free. So yeah, we look at it in that respect as well. Actually, interesting on those hypers, those problematic people who churn, they're also very open to advertising, more so than any other segment, which is fascinating.
Well, it makes sense. In a gut level, it sort of makes sense. And I think for the fast subscribe, well, they're not really subscribers. In a way, when you have a subscriber, they're doing you a favor when they leave, because they're putting their flag up and they said, I'm gone. Where for the ad-based services, you don't know that. They're just not around for a little bit, right? And you might be like, oh, they've abandoned me. They haven't told me on the way out, but they're just not engaged with the service anymore. So that makes it a little trickier.
For sure. Yeah. It's that's a little bit, it makes me think actually of one of the kind of conundrums around password sharing. If you're an ad-supported service, if I share my password with 4 people, well, that's more inventory. If I'm selling ads, I want inventory. On the other hand, if I'm purely a subscription-based model, arguably at least some of that should logically be lost revenue. Maybe some of those people are going to sign up. So there's kind of a tension there. If you're a subscription-based ad-supported service, the ad-supported boys, they like more inventory, and okay, I can monetize that. And there's a lot of thinking that goes on around, okay, if they are getting it for free, but we're monetizing their eyeballs through ads, maybe we're actually making more money out of those people than we would if they were subscribing only.
Yeah, so, for years they've been talking about password sharing is just free marketing. You extend it to somebody else. I mean, Netflix, I don't know where they are now, but they announced that they were going to sort of restrict password sharing, and then like last week or 2 weeks ago, they were like, well, maybe not. maybe it's the different voices within Netflix that are realizing, okay, if we're going to have an advertising based model, that may not be such a great idea to have this massive churn, or even force the issue for subscribers to say, hey, is this something I really need to really not want right now? Because maybe I'm one of those mainstreamers, or what was the other segment that tends to sit? Yes, exactly. So maybe you don't want them to, think through that calculus at this point in time until you get your business model straight. So this is fantastic, Mike. You guys are always innovating with new insights. I cannot believe that you said the correlation for predictive is 0.9, something like that. So it's
we've got a couple of different versions of the model, but I mean the basic one we use is a 0.92, which was extraordinary. Okay. I mean, we kind of went all over it and said that can't be right. Right. We actually had one that was 0.96 at one point, but we took one of the elements out because we're trying to focus the predictive model on things that streamers can actually do something about.
Yes.
Things that they can influence, because if you can measure the impact on churn of individual factors, then you can track your progress over time as you influence those factors. Right. So that was important. So yeah, it's a 0.92, and it's robust, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It is amazing. But to your point, if you're in the if you're in the rapid growth mode, you're just trying to this data may not be as helpful to you right off, because, or maybe it is, maybe because you can predict a little bit more, but you may not know enough about what your segments are at this point in time. You may not know who your audience is because you're just throwing stuff out there and you're drawing eyeballs in, and over time that data set becomes more and more predictable for you.
Well, the fun thing is, because we've looked across the landscape, we can actually say who your subscribers are. And we've got some great engagement from some major streamers right now. We're having really interesting conversations because, they've got a load of work of their own. This stuff is additive. This doesn't replace what they're doing. Okay. It layers on a whole nother level of insights. But you then start to say, okay, how can we append the segments that we have to your subscriber base and your data sets? So then you can really go in and you can start to look at stuff at a respondent level, and you can start to identify who sits where within our segmentation structure, which we can be predictive about. And then you can also look at how the competition are doing.
Right.
So integrating the data sets into client data stacks, I think is kind of where we'll go with this over the next few months, as we start to load in what we're getting out of the tracking, because that's how we can create the scenario planning tools where you can play around with, well, what happens if you increase your hypers by 5 and your loyalists by 8%, and so on.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I guess the question I would ask is, just being a former marketing guy, are they, when you go and engage your clients, are they sort of embarrassed they didn't have these insights, or they see you as a friendly, like, okay, it's just additional data?
Yeah, I mean, look, all of the streamers have a huge amount of insight on their subscribers, and a lot of them have the good segmentations and so forth. What most people don't have is something which looks across the landscape, and that you can apply in that way. And I mean, this has been great fun because we've been able to learn as we go and develop things. As I said at the very beginning, this is an under-researched subject. We have, as an industry, a fairly simplistic view of churn. That doesn't mean there's not good work out there, but it just hasn't really gone very, very deep, because, to the point you made earlier, Wall Street hasn't demanded that we focus in at this level, which is really simply all every other category of industry does, to understand at a segment level and understand how you can have differentiated marketing, because you've got to pursue profit. It's all been about tonnage, get more people. We're past that point now. So this is a fairly unique body of work, and we're going to keep on digging into it. And because as I said, we're getting great engagement from clients, and we're learning a lot as we go with them, and we want to help them make a difference. And also, I think something else you touched on, enable them to report out to Wall Street in a more nuanced way, and enable Wall Street to get more insights into their models to understand for themselves just what the realities of churn are. There's a lot of garbage talked in the business, frankly, and it's a distraction. So this helps bring some science to it and some substance, I hope.
No, it's great. It's very, I think the timing is perfect too. I mean, a lot of people are talking about reaching peak TV, and there's some truth to that, in that you do have to rob from Peter to pay Paul a little bit. We went through these few years where everybody was subscribing to everything, and now subscribers and viewers are a little more sophisticated about what their needs are, and they're starting to have these internal conversations I'm having with my family. Do we need all these services? So yeah, I think the subscriber is managing their portfolio, and the services have to manage their portfolio of different subscriber segments. So perfect. Kudos to you. Great job. So Mike, one of the things we like to do in these podcasts is sort of personalize the luminaries in the industry, people like yourself, and learn something about them that folks may not know. Is there something you can share, a hobby or an interest with our audience?
Well, some people know this already. I have a passion for single malt Scotch whiskey.
Nice.
I have a ridiculous amount of it in my house. I have well over 100 bottles. That's nothing compared to some people I know. I own casks of whiskey in warehouses in Scotland that are maturing away. It's a fascinating subject. It's a wonderful culture within the Scotch business. It's a huge multi-billion-dollar global business.
Oh, yeah, sure.
In so many ways, it's like a little cottage industry still. And it's really easy to get to meet people who are doing it. I mean, I have a friend who's a distiller of some of the major Scotch brands who I just got to meet at a whiskey show, and we had dinner and so on. It's fascinating, and there is so much variance within Scotch. Vastly different whiskies. It's fascinating. So yes, that's my affliction, if you like. That's what I did. What I did in the pandemic. A lot of people got into making sourdough bread. I doubled down on Scotch.
That is so cool. So I've got a favorite. I like my Balvenie Doublewood. Do you have any favorites that you share?
I have lots of favorites. People say, "What's your favorite whiskey?" And it depends what mood I'm in. Two distilleries I really like right now. One, Glen Scotia, which is out of Campbelltown. It's remarkably good whiskey and very, very good value. That's a magnificent whiskey. And another one, a new distillery. It's not been around very long. I think they only started releasing whiskey in about 2015, 2016. It's called Ardnah Merkin. A wonderful Scotch name, which you probably wouldn't be able to spell until your third or fourth attempt. They're putting out young whiskies that are absolutely phenomenal. It's a very, very remote distillery on the west coast of Scotland. Those are my two of my favorite whiskeys.
Well, I'm going to write them down because that's something to try. So do you have to be a whiskey aficionado to really understand the difference between, if you're a Johnny Walker Red or Johnny Walker or Black? I actually bought my first bottle of Johnny Walker Blue. Should you be able to sort of taste the differences and appreciate that? Or for the general sort of whiskey consuming public, would you recommend kind of more, I guess, pedestrian, brands of whiskey?
Well, depends on what's pedestrian depends on your perspective. I would regard Johnny Walker as a very pedestrian whiskey. I'm not a fan. It just kind of is, it's well made for what it is, but it's just not very interesting. Should you be able to tell? It's all about your palate. I mean, what you like is such a subjective and individual thing, and there shouldn't be any rules about how you drink whiskey. You want to add water, add water. You want to add ice, add ice. You want to put it in a cocktail, put it in a cocktail. Whatever you enjoy is what it should be about. But I don't know. It's fun stuff. I like an old fashioned, but I really lean into. I don't drink bourbons actually other than in an old fashioned, because to me bourbons are too smooth, too sweet, too easy to drink. Whereas you get a good single malt Scotch, it's got real character, and it can be vastly different. Sometimes it's a real surprise. Sometimes it's a bit difficult. You have to persevere if you can be bothered.
You want something to be drinking in the Scottish Highlands on a raw day, right? You don't want it easy and sweet and smooth.
No, well, if you like peated whiskies, then you're heading to Ireland. You got your Lagavulin and your Lafroig, and it's like being punched in the throat.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it's great stuff.
Leave the peat in the ground. I don't need it in my whiskey. So
yeah, why do you want dirt in your whiskey? It's lovely stuff.
And it's funny. There's a lot of parallels between whiskey and subscriber, choices with the content they're interested in, right? It's just what is their preference? What are they interested in, right?
Oh yeah, people get very passionate about this stuff as much as they do about their favorite TV shows. You're absolutely right.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, Mike Bloxham, thank you for joining us from MAGID Associates. We're signing off today. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. And next time we'll do it over a whiskey.
Sounds fantastic. This is Brian Mahoney with OTT Executive Podcast signing off. Everybody have a great day. Thank you.